Hello, everyone, and welcome from Amsterdam to this year's last regular press briefing on public health emergencies. I'm Marie-Agnes Heine, and I'm leading the communication department at the European Medicines Agency. And today we want to highlight some of the progress made on COVID-19 vaccines and treatments this year, but also give you some updates on the most recent developments. You then will have the opportunity to ask questions. I'm happy to introduce the speakers of today. So we have here Dr. Marco Cavalieri, the head of Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy and chair of EMA's Emergency Task Force, Dr. Georgi Genov, the head of Pharmacovigilance, and EMA's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Stefan Tierstrup. The briefing is broadcast via YouTube and Europe by satellite, and as always, you can use the footage free of charge. You will find the respective links in the invite to this briefing. I'm now handing over to Marco Cavalieri, who will provide you with a summary of this year's achievements and an update on the latest developments regarding COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. Marco, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for joining this press briefing. Today, we'll update you on EMA's activities on COVID-19 and other topics related to emerging public health issues. As this is the last press briefing in 2022, we would like to start by reminding how far we have come. We started this year with 5 authorized vaccines that targeted the original strain of SARS-CoV-2. 12 months later, we have a portfolio of 7 vaccines plus 4 adaptive vaccines that target several variants of the virus. Further, we assess data on the use of vaccines in children. Today, we have vaccines that can be used to immunize children from 6 months of age, particularly those with underlying conditions. Adaptation of the vaccines and their successful rollout have shown that we now have a viable framework to respond to significant mutations of the virus. From what we have learned so far with SARS-CoV-2, it is likely that we will have to update the vaccine regularly to offer revaccination to vulnerable groups, similarly to the arrangements that are in place for influenza. However, the pace of changes in the vaccine composition and of revaccination campaigns need to be carefully calibrated to maintain adherence to vaccination in the vulnerable population and sustain impact on the burden of disease over time. The virus is here to stay, and at this point, we are unable to predict exactly what will happen next. We will have to prudently move towards a new normal, making the best use of the tools that can protect us, starting from vaccines. So far, adaptive vaccines have primarily been used in booster campaigns. The EMA's Emergency Task Force, the ETF, has looked at the existing evidence on the benefits and risks of using these vaccines in primary vaccination. The ETF concluded that adapted messenger RNA bivalent vaccine targeting the original strain and Omicron BA.4/5 may be used for primary vaccination in unvaccinated children and adults who were not previously infected with SARS-CoV-2. The data suggest that primary vaccination with this vaccine should give rise to a broad immune response in people who have not yet been exposed to or vaccinated against COVID-19. The data also show that the safety profile of the adaptive vaccine when used as boosters is comparable to that of the original messenger RNA vaccines, for which the safety profile is well established. We are expecting additional information on the safety and effectiveness of the bivalent vaccines, including for primary vaccination, through further clinical research and observational studies. This recommendation aims to give more flexibility in the ongoing vaccination campaigns to the national public health authorities in the member states who decide how these adaptive bivalent vaccines are to be used. EMA Human Medicine Committee, the CHMP, has also just adopted a recommendation to include the use of original Spikevax vaccine and Spikevax bivalent original Omicron 1 and as a booster dose in children aged 6 to 11 years. This is part of the efforts to expand the use of the adaptive vaccine in the different age groups. Let's move to monoclonal antibodies now. The continuous mutation of the virus have impacted the effectiveness of monoclonal antibodies. On the 9th of December, the EMA's Emergency Task Force warned that some monoclonal antibodies with antiviral activity currently authorized to treat and/or prevent COVID-19 are unlikely to be effective against emerging strains of the virus. Recent laboratory studies show that monoclonal antibodies targeting the spike protein are poorly effective at neutralizing Omicron strains such as the BA.2.75.2 or XBB. Although it is not fully clear to what extent this reduction in neutralization will lead to lack of efficacy, it is of concern to see these powerful therapies losing significant activity against the emerging variants. The data also show that these monoclonal antibodies do not significantly neutralize BQ1 and BQ1.1. which are expected to become the dominant strains in the EU in the coming weeks and actually are already dominant in some member states. Therefore, it is recommended that healthcare professionals consider alternative treatments when subvariants such as BQ1.1 are dominant. Authorized antiviral treatments such as Paxlovid and Veklury, which have different mechanisms of action than monoclonal antibodies, retain their activity against the emerging strains and are expected to remain effective. Therefore, ETF encourages EU member states to ensure that their healthcare professionals have access to these antiviral treatments. Such a recommendation is focused on monoclonal antibodies that bind the virus and exert antiviral activity. Other monoclonal antibodies that act on the immune response and do not target the virus directly, such as Roctamer, for example, are not affected by emerging variants. Further, we will continue our discussion with developers to advance next-generation monoclonal antibodies as swiftly as possible. As a first step, yesterday, we had a meeting on monoclonal antibodies with the US Food and Drug Administration and international experts. Together, we reviewed where we are and how we can define development pathways that could allow timely approval and deployment of monoclonal antibodies active against emerging variants. There was general agreement that streamlined clinical trial focusing on neutralization of the emerging variants over time could represent a valid approach that would ensure rapid availability of new monoclonal antibodies that retain efficacy against contemporary strains of SARS-CoV-2. Moreover, advancement of monoclonal antibodies that have broader coverage of new variants, for example, by binding to conserved region of the spike protein that are not expected to change with the evolution of the virus, will be warranted. Monoclonal antibodies with antiviral activity are of special value for patients that might not respond well to vaccination, such as severely immunocompromised patients. They provide a tool for passive immunization that lasts for weeks or even months, protecting some of the most vulnerable patients from COVID. Even if the COVID-19 cases rates generally are stable in Europe, the situation can change very rapidly due to the emerging subvariants, as we are already seeing, for example, in the United States right now. In addition, the European Commission, the ECDC, the WHO have stated that this year the influenza season epidemic is off to an early start in the European region and that respiratory syncytial virus has been on the rise since October. ECDC Rapid Risk Assessment Report shows that this year there is more RSV activity and it began earlier than in the pre-COVID-19 seasons. While RSV is a common respiratory virus that usually causes mild cold-like symptoms, it can be serious, especially for babies, small children, and elderly. This autumn, EMA became the first regulator in the world to approve Beyfortus, a monoclonal antibody to prevent serious lower respiratory tract disease caused by RSV in newborns and children during their first RSV season. Beyfortus should be given before the RSV season when there is a risk of RSV infection in the community or as soon as possible after birth for babies born during the RSV season. Vaccines for RSV are in late stage of development, and one vaccine for the prevention of low tract respiratory disease in the elderly is already under assessment at EMA. There is a high risk that co-circulating RSV, influenza, and SARS-CoV-2 will place pressure on European healthcare systems in the coming weeks. This has already been reported in several European countries. Therefore, it is extremely important that vulnerable populations, elderly people, pregnant persons, and immunocompromised patients get revaccinated against influenza and COVID-19. Vaccines that combine flu and COVID that could simplify the vaccination campaigns in the future are under development. We remain ready to assess this vaccine to expand our portfolio of vaccines for respiratory viruses. Next, I would like to describe a significant step we have taken to transform vaccine monitoring in the EU. We have joined forces with the ECDC and launched the Vaccine Monitoring Platform, which will enhance our ability to continuously monitor the safety and effectiveness of authorized vaccines. This new platform will help to prioritize research, fund independent studies, and complement our knowledge of how vaccines work in real life. The first EU-funded study on the effectiveness and safety of the Mpox vaccine Imvanex is ongoing. Data from independent EU-funded studies will further strengthen the robustness of our decision-making, which is essential to build and maintain people's trust in the vaccines. The advisory body of this new vaccine platform, known as the Immunization and Vaccine Monitoring Advisory Board, IVMAB, held its first meeting in Amsterdam last week. The IVMAB is a forum that brings together vaccine regulatory experts and representatives from the EU national public health authorities. I will stop here and give the floor back to our moderator. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marco. We are now taking questions from journalists. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and turn on your camera. And when I give you the floor, we will unmute your microphone and you can then ask your question. So let's see what questions we have. So the first question comes from Victoria English from MedNu. Victoria, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the camera not working. I'd like to go back to Dr. Cavallari's comments about the monoclonal antibodies and the new approaches that might be taken to make these medicines effective. He talked about finding a conserved area on the spike or near the spike that might be used as a target for monoclonal antibodies. I'm just wondering whether he could elaborate a little bit about some of the research going on here.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I'm handing over to Marco about this question on the new approaches with the monoclonal antibodies. Marco.
Yeah, so there are two aspects here. On one side, thinking about whether we can be faster in granting access to new monoclonal antibodies that have activity against new emerging variants, because as you know, developing new medicinal products take quite a lot of time, and running clinical efficacy study in particular takes several months. So the concept here is whether we can streamline this process by putting in place clinical trials that will look mainly at biomarkers such as the neutralizing activity, the pharmacokinetic profile, or the ex vivo neutralization coming directly from subjects that receive the monoclonals. And looking at these biomarkers, we could find a way of being faster in approving new monoclonal antibodies that retain activity against the new variants so that they can be used when there is an actual need. The second area is to look into monoclonal antibodies that are less susceptible to the changes in the virus because they are binding to other portions of the spike protein that are not changing as frequently as we are seeing now. And there are a number of research groups and companies that are looking into this area. So we are very much supporting such efforts and happy to discuss with them as well how we can progress rapidly for approving these new monoclonal antibodies that indeed will reduce the chances that whenever the virus changes, then all these antiviral monoclonal antibodies lose activity. So more to come, but we are quite optimistic that we can define a pathway that will be helpful, and in the future, hopefully, we can have better tools.
Thank you very much, Marco. I do not see any additional question. That's the last chance. Otherwise, I'm going to close today's press briefing. I don't see any. I don't see anybody having a. Okay. I now see Sylvie Bernouf. Please go ahead.
Yes, hello. I would like to know whether EMA recommends to intensify the use of plasma from convalescent patients for the treatment of immunocompromised COVID-19 patients in the context of emerging variants such as BQ.1.1. Thank you.
I think you need to repeat. It was very unclear. We didn't really get the question. Can you get closer to your microphone, please?
Yes, sorry, do you hear me? Is it better?
Yes, I think it's better now.
Yes, I would like to know, does EMA recommend to intensify the use of plasma from convalescent patients for the treatment of immunocompromised COVID-19 patients in the context of emerging variants such as BQ.1.1?
Thank you very much. This is a question for Marco. It's about the use of plasma for the treatment.
Yeah, I think what we've seen so far, that convalescent plasma has not really been performing very well, or not as well as monoclonal antibodies, to say the least. So there are still some doubts about how we could consider the use of convalescent plasma. Also very important, we need to discuss what is the actual neutralization titers of this plasma before we can say that it could be suitable for treating such patients. So again, it's one of those areas that we are quite eager to entertain conversation with developers to see where we stand, but not forgetting that for the time being, with the preliminary version of the virus that were in circulation, we did not get fantastic results from this type of treatment. So it's important that we do not lose sight of this aspect. Nevertheless, it's true that in the face of these new subvariants, if we need better tools in order to protect particularly the immunocompromised, which is one of the target groups for this type of modality of treatment and prevention, then we have to consider this as well.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Helen Collis from Politico. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to find out if the European Medicines Agency was monitoring or as part of its new remit, any shortages in specific antibiotics at the moment. I'm thinking about in the UK in particular, we have high numbers of Group A streptococcus among children and several deaths and parents reporting difficulties getting hold of antibiotics. Is this something that is an EU-wide issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's definitely a topic that's coming up in many European member states, and I'm handing over to Dr. Stefan Tjirstrup to respond.
Many thanks for that question. I can definitely confirm that shortages is an issue that the European agency is dealing with. We have a coordinating role, and some of the shortages, of course, dealt with on national level, but having this medicine shortage steering group and points of contact for the member states and also from industry to report into. And in terms of antibiotics, and in particular amoxicillin, including amoxicillin with clavulanic acid, we know that most member states, actually 25 of the 27, are reporting local shortages. We are not at the bottom of the root cause yet, but we know that there is an increased demand, as you said yourself. The Group A streptococcus is also here in Europe, maybe not to the same extent as you've seen in the UK, but we also know from a few of the manufacturers that they have manufacturing capacity issues, some of them related to lack of staff, simply. So it's not so much, being able to produce the product, but producing the final product and bring it to the market. But as I said, we are not at the bottom, but we are definitely looking into this, not only us, but in collaboration with with all the EU member states in this shortage network.
Thank you very much. I'm also giving the floor to Marco Cavalieri for some additional information.
Yeah, no, just to add to what was just said by Dr. Tistrup is that, first of all, we should be reminded that antibiotics should be used appropriately, and therefore, if you got a cold or a viral infection, there is no need of using antibiotics and should be kept for use for when actually they are needed. So it's important that we maintain a prudent use approach for antibiotics in order also to maintain their efficacy and avoid antimicrobial resistance. The second point, which is a general reflection also associated with antimicrobial resistance, is that we are struggling to find new antibiotics because the private sector is not sufficiently incentivized to develop and commercialize new antibiotics because of the lack of return on investment. And this is a problem not only for new antibiotics, but also with respect to maintaining on the market old antibiotics that are still so important and needed as this surge of cases of strep A infections is showing. So it's important that we find a way to maintain capability in the European Union and in the world of having sufficient amount of crucial and life-saving antibiotics, whether new or old.
Thank you very much, Marco. We now have a question in the chat from Mélanie Mézières from Le Quotidien Pharmaceutique. So the question is for you, Marco, and she asks, can you tell us if there is any monoclonal antibody under rolling review or under assessment by EMA? I assume that you follow closely all developments, and what would be the most promising?
At the moment, there are no monoclonal antibodies under rolling review, but we are in discussion with some developers that have second-generation monoclonal antibodies, and indeed, that's why it's so important to have this opportunity to discuss with stakeholders, such as we did yesterday in the workshop together with FDA, to really pave the way in finding an appropriate regulatory path that could allow the rapid approval of these monoclonals. And we expect that we will see some coming to us at the beginning of next year or during next year.
Thank you very much. I do not see any additional hands right now, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you for attending today's press briefing. I also want to thank today's speakers, and please note that the first press briefing in the next year, in 2023, is currently planned to take place in the week commencing 23rd of January. And during the upcoming holiday season, EMA will continue to work on the COVID-19 related issues, but we will otherwise be closed until 4th of January. So it's for me only to wish you all a very happy Christmas and a good start in the new year. And I hope that you will all be able to enjoy some time off. And as always, if you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to get back to us and ask these. So thanks again and goodbye.